Human history is replete with tales of great conquerors, but few have left such an indelible mark as those who emerged from the harsh north. Appearing like specters from the misty, icy waters of the distant north, these fearless seafarers and warriors swiftly burst onto the world stage, forever altering its course. Their unstoppable advance began, and by the very end of the 8th century, they had already firmly established their dominant influence, striking terror into many nations. For the next 3 centuries, stretching deep into history, these formidable northern warriors, known as Vikings, continued their destructive work. Their ships plied the seas, and their swords sowed chaos, leaving behind only ruins and fear in once prosperous and civilized lands across Europe and beyond. It seemed nothing in this world possessed the power to halt their relentless progress. Not the boundless, perilous expanses of the oceans, which for others were insurmountable barriers, could restrain their thirst for discovery and conquest. Nor did the deep fear of the unknown, of what lay beyond the horizon, deter their daring expeditions. And certainly, not even the most powerful European monarchs, whose armies and fortresses crumbled under the onslaught of these furious invaders, could subdue them. But what drove these people? What was the true nature of their invincible strength? And from where did they draw their boundless courage? The answers to these questions reveal a surprising and at times shocking truth about the legendary warriors of the North. Through the prism of their formidable, almost wild appearance, an extraordinary chronicle emerges. These ruthless seafarers, brave colonizers, and enterprising traders, driven by an insatiable hunger for wealth, boldly forged paths beyond the then-known world. Their ships sailed waters from the distant North American shores to the bustling eastern bazaars of Baghdad. They became catalysts for grandiose social, political, and economic transformations before dissolving forever into the annals of history. Approximately 1,200 years ago, the Vikings, like predators unleashed upon an unsuspecting world, emerged from the icy depths of the North Sea. They came from lands scarred by fjords and washed by deep waters, from poor farms and ancient clan feuds, from the region now known as Scandinavia. They left behind legends full of violence and unparalleled courage, as well as sagas recounting their great explorations and conquests. However, something even more remarkable lay hidden in their homelands. In 1880, in the heart of Norway, Norwegian archaeologists made a stunning discovery that lifted the veil on the past and revealed the secrets of Viking life and death. Thanks to this incredible find, it became evident that Viking civilization was as developed, including artistically, as European nations of the time. The entrenched myth of wild northern barbarians who mindlessly attacked Europe was shattered. The same artifact, found in several burial sites across Scandinavia, tells more about the Vikings than any other discovery. It is the ship, a vessel that served as a tomb, filled with items believed to be needed by its owner for passage to the afterlife. These magnificent vessels, unearthed by archaeologists, were not only aesthetically perfect, but also astonishingly functional. Unusually thin and maneuverable, they could sail in waters as shallow as 7 centimeters, allowing them to travel up rivers. All the tools necessary for eternal life were placed in the ship, after which it was all buried. These items have come down to us in astonishing preservation. Who were these mysterious barbarians, with such complex burial rituals? And why did they become the scourge of the Dark Ages? To understand this, one must return to the late 8th century, to the highlands of Norway. Here, certain conclusions can be drawn about Viking life before they ventured out to sea in search of new lands. They were a settled, agricultural people living in various villages divided into clans. Family likely held immense importance for them, though there isn't complete certainty. Chieftains ruled the clans, and at times, wars erupted between them. Overall, Viking life was centered on survival. The climate was significantly colder than in the rest of Europe, and undoubtedly, survival was fraught with great difficulties. This is a crucial point to remember. At the dawn of the Viking Age, the family farm was the primary economic unit of this people. They were farmers and herders. Climatic conditions left them very little time for growing fruits and vegetables, and they largely depended on livestock. Peace in Scandinavia was coming to an end. The population was growing rapidly, and the demand for fertile land steadily increased. Tensions were extremely high, and violence erupted between Viking clans. Robbers with axes and swords attacked farmers with unprecedented brutality. The weakest were unable to resist. This war for land plunged Scandinavia into a state of complete anarchy. Each konung, chieftain, owned a large farm where workers and slaves lived. When he wanted to attack someone, he simply had to gather all his people. Vikings would infiltrate a village, take whatever they wanted, and immediately leave the scene. Their strategy was not particularly complex, but was exceedingly effective. Land and wealth became increasingly scarce in Scandinavia, and some Vikings set aside their internal disagreements, preparing to seek their fortunes elsewhere. The Vikings, who once built farms, now used their hands and tools for a completely different purpose. On the shores of the North Seas, an invention was taking shape that would forever change Viking civilization: the longship, or drakkar. This extraordinary vessel with its revolutionary design would alter the course of history and unleash an explosion of violence that would engulf Europe and the world for 3 centuries. For constructing longships, the Vikings utilized their extensive shipbuilding experience and their legendary seafaring skills. Without the longship, the Vikings would never have survived. It was the advancement of technology that allowed them to leave their mark on history. Over time, they learned to build vessels capable of crossing the North Atlantic. Thanks to longships, Vikings could travel very long distances. It took only 4 to 6 weeks to build one. The design remained consistent. They were built wider for calm waters and deeper for ocean voyages. If they needed a ship for the rivers of Russia and Europe, or to penetrate deeper into the continent, they simply built a slightly smaller version. Vikings could portage their longships from one body of water to another and then set sail because they were very light. This was critically important. Longships were lightning fast. No one could catch them. Unlike coastal vessels, which most Mediterranean ships were, Vikings could sail from Norway to Scotland, from the Faroe Islands to Iceland, and from there to Greenland. They could navigate river and lake waters that were too dangerous for coastal ships. The Vikings were fearless. They used technology to create a vessel with minimal draft and great adaptability, a marvel of engineering for that era. The Vikings had no single king or government to rule them. Villages operated independently, each with its own chieftain. Vikings would gather for these missions, leaving their wives and children to go to sea. They sought plunder and armed themselves accordingly. The first known raids occurred in June 793 on the island of Lindisfarne, located off the northeastern tip of England. Here stood St. Cuthbert's Monastery, one of the main religious centers of the British Isles. It was full of piety and more tangible riches. A horn sounded. Monks were going to Mass when they saw these longships emerging from the sea. A true vision of hell, devils coming straight from the underworld. The Vikings were warriors whose values were based on intimidation, fear, and terrorism. They were raiders, not soldiers. The Vikings were incredibly fierce, extremely greedy, and exceptionally skilled. They are often described as barbarians, but they attacked their targets with great discipline and displayed extreme military precision. A Viking warrior was a true fighting machine, a muscular Norseman dressed in leather armor. He was armed with simple tools, a knife, a sword, and a long-handled axe. The latter was claimed to be the most formidable weapon. Vikings were very skilled at throwing it to decapitate their victims, or at least maim them. Monasteries along the coast attracted Vikings due to their abundant wealth and the passivity of the monks. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, begun by the end of the 9th century, is a primary source for the history of England between the 5th and 11th centuries. It recorded the horror caused by the Viking invaders as follows. The barbarians plundered God's church at Lindisfarne, looting and killing. This sacrilegious attack in 793 on the monks and their treasures went down in history as the first significant act of the Vikings. But the attacks on Lindisfarne and other monasteries along the coasts of the British Isles were just the beginning. The 8th century was drawing to a close, and the Vikings were thinking big. The great cities of Europe would soon become targets for the might of these brutal northerners, and the enemy would be merciless. The Vikings left Scandinavia in search of wealth. The 793 attack in northern England unleashed a veritable hurricane of Viking violence that threatened to engulf all of Europe. We are in the mid-9th century, approximately 50 years after the attack on Lindisfarne. Europe was rich, and the Vikings. Scandinavian communities strengthened themselves to create better living conditions at the expense of Europeans who did not expect an attack. Crucially, many religious emblems found in monasteries, such as crosses, were made of silver. Viking factions set sail without a sovereign to unite them. Their fleets grew and could number dozens of ships. The flotillas were independent of each other, making them even harder to stop. Each Viking's reputation grew, as did their ambitions. Europe was at their feet. Unlike other continents, Europe is crisscrossed by many rivers. North America has only a few major waterways. Viking ships were narrow and required very little water to sail. They could move virtually anywhere. One of the first Viking river attacks occurred in 845. It was led by Ragnar, a famous Viking chieftain from Denmark. Deciding to continue the Lindisfarne tradition, he led his army and a fleet of 120 longships into battle up the Seine. His target was Paris. Before reaching the city, Ragnar's men encountered the French vanguard on the banks of the Seine and completely annihilated it. Legend has it that Ragnar's army crucified 11 soldiers that day. A monk from the region described the decades of Viking violence and plunder along the Loire. Ships grew in number, and the ranks of the Vikings continued to swell. Christians became victims of plunder and unimaginable massacres. The Vikings destroyed everything in their path. They were impossible to resist. They sailed up the Seine and headed for Paris. The city of Paris was well fortified. King Charles the Bald of France decided to buy peace rather than engage them in battle and risk annihilation. He gave Ragnar nearly 6 tons of gold and silver ingots for him to leave France permanently. But his strategy did not have the desired effect. The Vikings learned about the wealth that abounded in Europe and how easily it could be obtained. They multiplied their attacks in the north and throughout the rest of the continent. Between 790 and 1100, the Vikings penetrated into the heart of the continent, using all major waterways. The New World. It was the Norwegians who wrote the most captivating chapter in Viking history. These brave explorers colonized Iceland and Greenland. The colonization of Greenland is associated with the legendary Eric the Red and his son. Eric the Red led an expedition to Greenland in the late 10th century. He became the first to settle on this harsh land. Due to his volatile temper, Eric the Red was exiled from Iceland for 3 years. He traveled west to settle on the coast of Greenland. Although only a few kilometers of the coast were habitable, he claimed Greenland was fertile land, but life there remained very difficult. The land was almost unsuitable for cultivation, but one could fish and hunt. The climate was very severe. Eric the Red commanded a small community that lived day by day. As a form of government, the villagers convened a legislative assembly, as in their homeland, where free men could speak on matters concerning the community. Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson, like his father, was eager to explore the world. In the year 1000, he left Greenland, guided by rumors. Another Viking explorer claimed that the wind had blown his ship off course when he was trying to reach another colony in Greenland. He managed to reorient himself and found himself off the coast of a country with lush vegetation. This was, of course, not Greenland. Based on these accounts, Leif Erikson set out to conquer the West and discovered the New World. It is a fascinating story. It is believed that the Vikings discovered America in the year 1000. It is known that Leif Erikson colonized Newfoundland in 1000. Thus, there is certainty that Vikings were in Newfoundland. They may even have reached more southern regions. But the Greenlanders could not establish a permanent foothold there. It is assumed that the colony in Newfoundland lasted only 10 years. 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus's voyage, the Vikings had already forged a connection between the hemispheres. After his short stay in Newfoundland, Leif Erikson returned to Greenland and brought something new. With the same hands that built longships, the Vikings built the crosses of a new religion. They decided to convert to Christianity. The King of Norway asked Leif Erikson to Christianize Greenland, and he fulfilled his duty. If the Vikings were increasingly influencing the world, the reverse was also true. Chieftains saw Christianity as a means to unite their people and simultaneously strengthen their power over them. At the dawn of the 11th century, 200 years after the attack on Lindisfarne, the Vikings still had no single sovereign. There was very little solidarity between the various clans. Christianity could serve to unite the people. However, some pagan groups resisted the arrival of Christianity and refused to abandon their ancient gods. Kings were interested in Christianity as it allowed them to consolidate their power, but the people struggled against this new authority and did not want to abandon their customs. This frightened them. Christian missionaries traveled to the island and converted several Vikings, but many were skeptical. Christians decided to challenge the pagan deities. So, they confronted a berserker, a mad warrior, a representative of these pagan gods. The missionaries lit one bonfire and then told the pagans to do the same. If the berserker can pass through your fire but not through ours, Christianity will be the great victor. If he cannot pass through your fire, paganism will win. It seemed this trial was taken straight from the Old Testament. Legend has it that the berserker managed to pass through the pagans' fire, but not through the Christians. Therefore, the Vikings concluded that Christianity was the true religion and converted. Meanwhile, in Norway, a young Viking played a catalytic role in uniting the Viking people. Harald Hardrada was the half-brother of King Olaf. He was also his heir. Harald was only 15 when the Viking Civil War called him to battle. He found himself on the losing side, but Harald would one day take revenge and write his own history with the blood of his enemies. The Vikings descended upon Europe like a terrible, deadly epidemic. They began with attacks on defenseless monasteries. Soon after, the Vikings terrorized the rest of the continent. Eventually, they would even start killing each other. In 1030, in the midst of civil war, the Battle of Stiklestad pitted the forces of the Danish king, Knut the Great, against the troops of the Norwegian king Olaf. In the mid-11th century, against a backdrop of internal conflicts that bloodied the land and soul of Norway, Harald, King Olaf's half-brother and heir, became a grown man. He had ambitions to unite and lead the Norwegian people, but to do so, he first needed to seize power. Harald is an interesting character. He began his Viking training very early. He was only 16 when he was forced to flee Norway, wounded in the battle that cost his half-brother Olaf his life. Harald was forced into exile in distant northern lands. He went to Sweden and then headed to Kiev, a thriving trading city in modern-day Ukraine. In 1031, he followed the same path as the Swedish Vikings who, over the previous 2 centuries, had established trading cities to gain access to exotic goods from the east. The Swedes came to this region as pure barbarians, but settled there to become cosmopolitan traders. Thanks to the trade that linked the Viking world with the vast world of the East, Harald immediately appreciated its advantages. The treasures of that time abounded with coins from all over the world. Even Buddha statues were found in the ruins of a Viking city. The Vikings traded with many other civilizations, a fact far more important than stories of plunder and massacre. It was at this crossroads of cultures and trade that Harald realized his plunder was worthless if there was nowhere to sell it. He learned this lesson well. Vikings lived by trade for hundreds of years. They plundered monasteries and took chalices and manuscripts. But these items had no intrinsic value to them. They had to exchange them to get what they truly wanted. Vikings not only traded material goods, they were also slave traders. They did not hesitate to sell men and women they captured during their raids. Women often died during the journey and had to be replaced. Vikings raped women before selling them into slavery. Despite these economic lessons, Harald did not limit himself to simply making a fortune from trade. His Viking heart drove him to become a warrior and acquire all the necessary knowledge to become king. In 1038, Harald felt confident and set out for new conquests. He led an elite unit of Viking mercenaries. He suppressed rebellions on behalf of several Eastern European kings, accumulating wealth and increasing his power, preparing for his return to Norway to seize the throne. In Sicily, Harald displayed remarkable ingenuity. Harald's military genius was characterized by cunning rather than bravery. Deceit was a virtue among Vikings. They didn't just attack people head-on. Vikings preferred trickery. To capture a city, Harald ordered his men to catch all the small birds in the area. They tied small twigs to the birds with resin and released them to their nests on thatched roofs. The birds set the city on fire, and the Vikings captured it. In the 13th century, the Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson described Harald's conquest of Sicily and the effectiveness of his strategy in a work called Heimskringla. specifically in Harald Hardrada's saga. He writes, "The Sicilians abandoned the city, begging for mercy. These were the same people who had insulted the army and its leader just days before. Harald spared the lives of all who sought his mercy. He became master of the city. After 15 years of exile, Harald had accumulated enough power and wealth to finally claim his rightful place on the throne of Norway, which was torn by internal conflicts. In 1046, he returned to Scandinavia as a famous mercenary, armed with wealth and the ambition of a king. All he lacked was the crown, as the successor to the King of Norway. However, there was a problem. His nephew was the new King of Norway. To ascend the throne, Harald had to make an agreement. He was very cunning. He told his nephew that they could share the kingdom. A year later, his nephew died. There is no evidence that Harald killed him, but there were many accusations. In the end, Harald found himself at the head of the kingdom and finally took possession of it. Now Harald wanted to ensure his power would not be challenged. In 1047, he decided to eliminate his enemies. His revenge was terrible. He combined strategy and fury to attack all his opponents. In 1047, having gained strength over the years, Harald Hardrada became King of Norway. His reign was marked by violence. His army devastated the farms and villages of his opponents. The message was clear: people must submit, or they would perish. Throughout Norway, Harald's enemies paid for their disloyalty. In Harald Hardrada's saga, the king boasts of his cruelty. "I kill without the slightest remorse and remember every one of my victories. Treason must be crushed before it crushes me. All means are good, for treason breeds rebellion." Once the rebellion was suppressed, the Vikings were ready to celebrate. King Harald's supporters would go to him for lavish feasts. Vikings with much gold were influential in their community, as they gave money to their countrymen. This is how they formed armies. People needed to be fed. A warrior or skald who distinguished himself was rewarded with a ring or a golden goblet. Thus, to maintain power among the Vikings, one had to possess immense wealth. It was for this reason that Harald plundered so many palaces. That's how he managed to accumulate so much gold. He had to be known for his victories and ensure the security of his warriors. Vikings gathered for lavish feasts where they drank much mead and received much gold. And when the need arose, the Vikings would gather, take their swords, and set out on a raid for plunder. Viking life revolved around these feasts. During these celebrations, political intrigues arose, bribes were given, alliances were formed, and people exercised their power. Their political system was flexible enough to allow Vikings to benefit from any situation. However, everything could collapse if a chieftain died on the battlefield or was humiliated by an opponent. When this happened, another Viking, often very different from his predecessor, was ready to take his place. Taking Kiev as a model, King Harald established an important trading city, strategically located on the coast, where goods from all over the world were available. He implemented his plan in Oslo, a city destined to become one of the country's largest ports. Harald understood perfectly that trade would unite the Viking people, who would gain the wealth and stability they so desired. Oslo's markets were abundant with products from Viking farms: wheat, vegetables, furs, and textiles. Longships brought goods from all over the world: spices, gold, textiles, precious stones, and slaves. The markets were full of pottery and glass from Germany, jewelry from France, and coins from distant Arab lands. Oslo prospered, and the Vikings became astute traders. Items found in their tombs speak volumes about the lifestyle of this community's inhabitants: gold-engraved weapons, jewelry, as well as more modest wooden items belonging to the Vikings. But the development of this trading city only intensified King Harald's greed. Harald decided he needed a more significant objective. He set his sights on England. King Harald Hardrada embarked on an adventure, setting sail with a massive fleet and joining the rebellious brothers of the King of England. On his way to England, Harald undoubtedly envisioned a future where he ruled an empire as vast as he could imagine. This former exile now wielded great influence and power among his warlike people. He had already defeated his opponents, and no one dared to oppose his actions. The riches of England seemed within reach, but the English army was disciplined and resilient. Harald was about to face the most difficult battle of his life. This struggle threatened to destroy everything he had built. In late September 1066, a rider rushed to the city of York with ominous news. The Viking king Harald Hardrada was approaching. The English knew his reputation as a brutal man well. They had to act quickly and show great courage to stop him. He had already begun his conquest of the coast, winning a series of brutal victories. His triumph seemed assured. The city of York appeared ready to capitulate. Harold and his troops headed to Fulford, 11 kilometers from the city. He expected the English forces to pay him tribute by offering hostages. Harold, convinced that northern England was already his, set out for Stamford Bridge with only a portion of his army. His warriors wore no armor. However, the English army was far from carefree. King Harold Godwin's son led his soldiers on a forced march through the forest to intercept the Viking army. His swordsmen were clad in chain mail, and his archers were well equipped. They were determined to halt the Viking assault and save their city. According to the Icelandic sagas, the Vikings were caught by surprise by the English army. They only saw their armor gleaming in the sun and didn't know who they were. Eventually, they realized it was the English army. As per this saga of Harold Greycloak, the glistening weapons appeared to the Vikings like a layer of ice. Harold had a decision to make. Instead of retreating to await the rest of his men, he chose to fight the English. The English initially retreated, leading Harold to believe his forces had won. His troops then rested. Legend has it that a single warrior held the English at bay on the bridge. Armies were small in the Middle Ages. It was rare for multiple large armies to engage. According to this saga of Harold Greycloak, Harold encouraged his men, saying, "Fight with your heads held high. Swords are the only fate for warriors who surrender." The warrior on the bridge eventually fell, allowing the English to reach Harold. The English then crossed the bridge and attacked the Vikings. The battle commenced. Harold and his men fought against the English army, who battled with desperate energy. Vikings fell one by one, their blood soaking the English ground. It was a true massacre. The Icelandic sagas attest to the battle. Their king never faltered. He displayed courage throughout this fierce struggle. His blood-soaked sword put the enemy to flight. In the thick of the fight, King Harald Hardrada took an arrow to the throat. Reinforcements arrived too late. The English soldiers, superior in number, overwhelmed the Vikings, who were annihilated. As night fell, the defeat was undeniable. Harold had arrived in England in September 1066 with thousands of soldiers and boundless ambition. He met defeat and death. Any who returned to Norway from England did so in the ensuing decades. They continued to raid, but none of these attacks were as ambitious as Harold's final battles, which marked a new era in European history. By the time of Harold's death in 1066, the Vikings had already left their mark on culture, trade, and history worldwide. Harold's demise signaled the twilight of the Viking Age. The Vikings eventually became victims of assimilation in the very lands they had colonized. Furthermore, they could not withstand the growing influence of Christianity. In European history, Russia became the land of the Rus, descendants of the Vikings. Normandy is the land of the Normans, also descendants of the Vikings, who later conquered England. The Viking legacy is deeply ingrained in European history. Vikings were warriors, colonizers, explorers, and traders. They initiated several social and political changes. Among other things, they contributed to global economic growth, the strengthening of Europe, the development of national identity, and advancements in shipbuilding and navigation. While the Vikings earned a reputation as barbarians through their brutal raids, their relentless pursuit of power and wealth did not destroy Western civilization. The Vikings enriched our world forever.